Congratulations, sweetheart. You're now officially engaged to marry me, and considering you can't even remember last night, I'd say you got the better end of this deal. Grace Parker's eyes snapped open to find herself staring at a ceiling that definitely wasn't hers, unless she'd somehow acquired a taste for hand-painted Renaissance frescoes and crystal chandeliers the size of small cars overnight. The silk sheets beneath her fingers felt like liquid silver, and the mattress was so ridiculously comfortable it probably cost more than her annual salary at the accounting firm. What the? She bolted upright, immediately regretting the sudden movement as her head pounded like a mariachi band having a disagreement. That's when she saw him. Garrett Blackstone, New York's most notorious billionaire playboy, sitting casually in a leather armchair that looked like it belonged in a museum, sipping coffee from what was undoubtedly real gold-rimmed china. And he was fully dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit while she was... Grace looked down and nearly choked. She was wearing the most exquisite silk nightgown she'd ever seen, in a shade of emerald that probably had its own patent. "Please tell me this is some sort of elaborate prank," she croaked, her voice sounding like she'd been gargling gravel. Garrett's lips curved into a smile that was equal parts devastating and infuriating. "I'm afraid not, darling. Though I have to admit, your performance last night was Oscar-worthy. Especially the part where you declared your undying love for me in front of 500 of Manhattan's most influential people." Grace's face went through approximately 17 different shades of mortification. "I did what?" "Oh, it gets better." He stood up with the fluid grace of a predator, all 6'3" of him radiating the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. "You also insisted we make it official immediately. Something about not wanting to waste another moment living a lie." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box. "Hence the engagement ring you demanded I put on your finger at midnight." The ring was, well, calling it stunning would be like calling the sun slightly warm. The diamond was so large it could probably be seen from space, surrounded by smaller stones that twinkled like captured starlight. "This is insane," Grace whispered, staring at her own hand in horror. "I don't even drink. Well, not usually." "Okay, maybe wine with dinner, but I certainly don't get drunk enough to..." She stopped mid-sentence as fragments of memory began trickling back. The charity auction, her boss forcing her to attend as the company representative, the horrible speech she'd had to give about community outreach. And then, "The champagne," she groaned, burying her face in her hands. "Maria said it was just a little stronger than usual." "Ah, yes, your charming friend Maria. Lovely woman. She's the one who suggested the Vegas-style proposal, actually. Said you'd always been too practical for your own good and needed someone to shake up your boring life." Garrett's eyes sparkled with mischief. "I have to say I found her enthusiasm infectious." Grace peeked through her fingers. "Please tell me we didn't actually get married?" "No. Unfortunately, the paperwork requires a bit more sobriety than you were capable of mustering. But the engagement..." He gestured to the ring. "That's quite real, as is the rather binding contract you insisted we both sign." "Contract?" Grace's voice went up an octave. "What kind of contract?" Garrett moved to an ornate desk and returned with a folder thick enough to choke a horse. "A prenuptial agreement with some rather unique clauses. Apparently, drunk Grace is quite the negotiator. You insisted on a 6-month trial engagement to see if we're compatible, during which time you'll live here, attend social functions as my fiancé, and help me improve my severely damaged reputation with decent society." He chuckled. "Your words, not mine. And you agreed to this madness because, my dear Grace, you also happened to mention that my biggest rival, Marcus Sterling, has been trying to poach clients by spreading rumors about my, quote, inability to maintain meaningful relationships due to obvious character defects." His expression darkened slightly. "This engagement solves several problems at once. I get a respectable fiancé to improve my image, and you get..." He gestured around the opulent bedroom, then smirked. "Well, let's just say your student loans are about to become significantly less pressing." Grace stared at him, then at the ring, then at the contract that apparently bore her signature in what looked suspiciously like her handwriting. This is like a really twisted fairy tale. The kind where Cinderella wakes up hungover in the prince's bed with a binding legal document and no memory of how she got there. Garrett's grin was absolutely wicked. I prefer to think of it as a romantic comedy with excellent lawyers. Despite everything, Grace felt her lips twitch. You're enjoying this way too much. Guilty as charged. Though I have to admit, sober Grace is proving to be far more entertaining than I anticipated. He moved closer and she caught a whiff of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her traitorous pulse skip. The question is, sweetheart, are you going to honor the contract your alter ego negotiated? Or are you going to run screaming back to your studio apartment and your ramen noodle dinners? Grace looked around the bedroom that was literally larger than her entire apartment, then down at the ring that caught the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and finally back at Garrett's insufferably handsome face. 6 months? She asked weakly. 6 months, he confirmed. And Grace? I should probably mention that your resignation letter from Patterson and Associates was hand-delivered this morning. Apparently, drunk Grace was quite thorough in burning bridges. Grace flopped backward onto the impossibly soft pillows and stared at the painted cherubs on the ceiling. I'm either having the most elaborate nightmare of my life, or I just accidentally stumbled into the plot of every romance novel I've ever secretly read. Garrett's laughter was rich and genuine. Welcome to your new life, fiancé. Try not to look so terrified. I promise the next 6 months will be anything but boring. If you're going to be my wife, you'll need to learn that in my world, people don't apologize for taking up space. They make sure everyone else moves out of their way. Grace nearly choked on her orange juice as Garrett's declaration echoed through the palatial dining room. She'd been marveling at the fact that breakfast here apparently required 3 different types of forks, when his casual comment about her being his wife hit her like a freight train loaded with reality checks. Fake wife, she corrected, pointing her sterling silver fork at him with more confidence than she felt. And for the record, I've never had a problem taking up space. I just prefer not to steamroll innocent bystanders in the process. Garrett's eyes sparkled with amusement as he elegantly cut into what Grace suspected was the most expensive omelet in Manhattan. Innocent bystanders? Sweetheart, in my social circle, innocents died sometime around the Gilded Age. These people would sell their own grandmothers for a good stock tip. Well, that's cheerful, Grace muttered, then nearly jumped out of her skin as a woman in an impeccable black uniform appeared at her elbow like a well-dressed ninja. More coffee, Miss Parker? The woman asked with a smile that was both professional and genuinely warm. Oh, yes, please. Thank you. Grace floundered, realizing she had no idea what to call the woman who had apparently been serving her breakfast like she belonged here. Mrs. Henderson, Garrett supplied smoothly. She's been running this household since before I learned to walk. Fair warning, she's the only person in New York who can make me feel like a scolded 5-year-old. Mrs. Henderson's smile turned positively mischievous. Only when you deserve it, Master Garrett, which to be fair is fairly often. She turned to Grace with obvious approval. It's lovely to have someone with proper manners in this house for once, Miss Parker. Someone who says please and thank you instead of just barking orders. I don't bark, Garrett protested, looking genuinely offended. You growl then, Mrs. Henderson replied without missing a beat. Like a very expensive, well-groomed wolf. Grace couldn't help it, she burst out laughing. The sound echoed through the formal dining room with its crystal chandeliers and oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors, bringing an unexpected warmth to the intimidating space. I like her, Grace announced, grinning at Mrs. Henderson. She's got your number. Everyone's a comedian, Garrett grumbled, but Grace caught the fond smile he tried to hide behind his coffee cup. Speaking of which, we need to discuss your debut into society. The Vanderbilt charity luncheon is tomorrow and… Whoa, hold up. Grace held up her hand like a traffic cop. Yesterday I was balancing other people's books and eating microwave dinners. Today you want me to hobnob with Vanderbilts? I don't even know which fork to use for the salad. The smaller one on the outside, Garrett said automatically. And you'll learn. My image consultant will be here at 10 to begin your transformation. The way he said transformation made Grace's feminist hackles rise like a cat facing a vacuum cleaner. "Excuse me? What exactly is wrong with how I look?" Garrett's gaze swept over her appreciatively, taking in the way the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the auburn highlights in her hair and made her green eyes sparkle. She was wearing one of the designer outfits that had mysteriously appeared in the closet, a simple but elegant cream-colored blouse and tailored navy pants that fit her curves perfectly. "Nothing," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected sincerity that made her heart skip. "Absolutely nothing is wrong with how you look, Grace. But unfortunately, the vultures we'll be dining with tomorrow will be looking for any excuse to tear you apart. I won't give them the ammunition." The protective edge in his voice surprised them both. Grace felt something flutter in her chest, a dangerous warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "So what you're saying is, I need to be perfect enough to survive the Shark Tank," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "What I'm saying is that you're already perfect. We're just going to make sure everyone else realizes it too." Before Grace could process that statement, or the way it made her feel like she might spontaneously combust, the dining room doors burst open with the dramatic flair of a Broadway entrance. "Darling!" A woman who looked like she'd stepped off the cover of Vogue glided into the room, all flowing silk scarves and perfectly styled platinum hair. "You simply must tell me this engagement rumor isn't true, because I've already picked out the most divine little yacht for our Mediterranean getaway this summer." Grace watched in fascination as Garrett's entire demeanor shifted. His relaxed posture turned rigid, his warm smile became coolly polite, and his eyes went flat as winter ice. "Hello, Mother," he said with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a tax audit. "Grace, meet Vivian Blackstone. Mother, this is my fiancée, Grace Parker." Vivian's gaze swept over Grace with the precision of a forensic accountant looking for discrepancies. Grace felt herself being mentally catalogued, evaluated, and quite possibly found wanting, all in the span of about 3 seconds. "How quaint," Vivian finally said, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "And what is it you do, dear, besides catch my son in a moment of temporary insanity?" Grace felt the familiar fire that had gotten her through college on scholarship and landed her a job at one of Manhattan's most prestigious accounting firms. She stood up, matching Vivian's height in her designer heels, and extended her hand with a smile that was pure sunshine and hidden steel. "I'm an accountant, Mrs. Blackstone. I specialize in finding creative ways people hide their money from the IRS." "Fascinating work, really. You'd be amazed what people think they can get away with." The silence that followed was so complete Grace could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Garrett's expression had shifted from resignation to something that looked suspiciously like pride. Vivian's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, she's clever, Garrett. I can see why you're amused by her. Though I do hope you're not expecting this little arrangement to last beyond whatever midlife crisis prompted it." "Actually," Grace said sweetly, "I'm expecting it to last exactly as long as Garrett and I want it to, which, considering how well we seem to complement each other, might be quite a while." She slipped her hand into Garrett's, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers and the slight tremor that ran through his fingers at her touch. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Mrs. Blackstone, we have a very busy day ahead. Apparently, I need to learn how to be fabulous enough for the Vanderbilt luncheon." Grace's smile could have powered Times Square. "Though between you and me, I think I'm off to a pretty good start." As they walked out of the dining room together, Grace could feel Vivian's shocked stare burning into her back. It wasn't until they reached the marble foyer that Garrett started laughing, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his entire face. "Grace Parker," he said, turning to face her with something that looked dangerously close to admiration. "I think this arrangement is going to be far more entertaining than either of us bargained for." "Just wait until tomorrow," Grace replied, her confidence surprising even herself. "If you think I'm entertaining now, you haven't seen anything yet. Darling, you're supposed to be madly in love with me, not look like you're calculating my tax liability. Though I have to admit, your death glare is surprisingly arousing." Grace's fork paused halfway to her mouth as Garrett's whispered comment reached her across the Vanderbilt Estates garden terrace. Around them, Manhattan's elite picked delicately at their organic salmon while engaging in the kind of polite conversation that could destroy reputations with a single raised eyebrow. Grace had been doing mental math, specifically calculating how much this single luncheon probably cost versus her monthly rent, when Garrett caught her accountant face. "Sorry," she murmured back, forcing her expression into what she hoped looked like besotted adoration rather than mild nausea. "I'm still processing the fact that these people spent more on flowers than most people make in a year." "Welcome to my world, sweetheart," Garrett replied, his hand finding hers on the pristine white tablecloth. The simple touch sent an unwelcome jolt of electricity up her arm. "Try to look like you're enjoying the privilege." "Oh, I am," Grace said sweetly, loud enough for their table companions to hear. "It's fascinating to observe such refined behavior up close." Lady Margaret Pemberton, whose family apparently owned half of Connecticut, leaned forward with the predatory smile of someone smelling fresh gossip. "And what did you say you do again, dear? Before you became engaged to our dear Garrett?" Grace felt the weight of 6 pairs of calculating eyes settling on her like expensive vultures. This was it, the moment Garrett had warned her about. She could play it safe, downplay her background, try to fit in, or she could be herself. "I'm a forensic accountant," Grace said with the confidence of someone who'd earned every one of her credentials the hard way. "I specialize in following money trails for fraud investigations. You'd be amazed how creative people get when they're trying to hide assets from the government, or their spouses." The silence that followed was so profound that Grace could hear a butterfly landing on the centerpiece roses. "How practical," murmured Countess something or other, whose accent was so affected it sounded like she was choking on her own vowels. "Very practical," Grace agreed cheerfully. "Just last month I helped the FBI recover $12 million that had been donated to a charity that turned out to be someone's yacht payment fund. The yacht was lovely, though. Shame they had to give it back." Garrett's thumb traced over her knuckles, whether in warning or encouragement she couldn't tell. But when she glanced at him, his eyes were sparkling with something that looked suspiciously like pride. "Grace has such interesting stories," he said smoothly. "She was just telling me about a case involving a prominent socialite who tried to claim her plastic surgery as a business expense, something about maintaining her professional appearance." Grace nearly snorted with laughter. "Oh, that one was creative." She deducted her nose job, tummy tuck, and breast augmentation as necessary equipment upgrades for her position as a charity board member. The IRS was less than amused. "How dreadful," Lady Margaret said faintly, her hand unconsciously moving to her own suspiciously perfect nose. "These nouveau riche people have no sense of propriety." "Actually," Grace said with devastating innocence, "she was third-generation old money. Apparently, financial desperation makes criminals of us all." The woman sitting across from them, some oil heiress whose jewelry could fund a small country, suddenly developed an intense interest in her salad. "Grace," Garrett said, his voice warm with affection that sounded almost real, "you're terrible. These poor ladies don't know what to do with you." "I'm just being honest," Grace replied, batting her eyelashes at him with theatrical innocence. "Isn't that what you fell in love with? My refreshing honesty?" "Among other things," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips for just a moment too long. The heat that flared between them was definitely not part of the act, and from the way Garrett's grip on her hand tightened, he felt it too. "How romantic," came a honeyed voice from behind them. "Though I have to say, Garrett, your taste has certainly evolved." Grace turned to see a woman who looked like she'd been carved from marble by a particularly talented sculptor with a thing for ice queens. Platinum blonde hair pulled into a perfect chignon, diamonds that probably had their own insurance policies, and a smile that could freeze hell. "Victoria," Garrett said, his voice carefully neutral. "How unexpected." "Is it?" Victoria Sterling glided closer with predatory grace. "When I heard about your sudden engagement, I simply had to see for myself. After all, it wasn't so long ago that you were telling me how marriage was for people who'd given up on adventure." Grace felt something ugly twist in her stomach, something that felt suspiciously like jealousy, which was ridiculous because this was all fake anyway. "People change," Grace said pleasantly, standing up to meet Victoria at eye level. In her designer heels, she had a good 2 inches on the other woman, especially when they meet the right person. Victoria's laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Oh, darling, I'm sure you're delightful. Though I have to ask, is it true you were working as some sort of bookkeeper? How charmingly quaint." "Forensic accountant," Grace corrected with a smile that could cut diamonds. "I track down people who steal money and lie about it. It's amazing how good I've gotten at spotting fraud." The word fraud hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's perfect composure flickered for just a moment. "How useful," Victoria said. "I imagine Garrett finds your particular skill set quite illuminating." "Every single day," Garrett said, standing up to wrap his arm around Grace's waist. The gesture was possessive, protective, and sent heat shooting through Grace's entire body. Grace has a remarkable talent for seeing through pretense. It's one of the things I adore about her. His thumb traced a small circle on her hip, and Grace had to concentrate on breathing normally. "Well," Victoria said, her smile becoming positively arctic, "I suppose we'll see how long this little experiment lasts. After all, Garrett, you've never been known for your staying power when it comes to relationships." "Maybe I just hadn't found the right woman," Garrett replied, his gaze never leaving Grace's face. "Someone worth staying for." The sincerity in his voice caught Grace completely off guard. For a moment, she forgot they were acting, forgot about Victoria's cutting remarks and the judgmental stares of their lunch companions. For a moment, it was just Garrett looking at her like she was something precious and unexpected. "I think," Grace said quietly, her voice slightly breathless, "I'm the lucky one in this arrangement." "Arrangement?" Victoria pounced on the word like a cat on a wounded mouse. "How interesting choice of words." Grace's heart stopped for approximately 3 beats before her brain kicked back into gear. "The arrangement of this engagement," she said smoothly. "Garrett insisted on handling all the wedding planning details. He says I'm too important to waste time on flowers and seating charts." "How considerate," Victoria said, but her eyes were sharp with suspicion. "I'm a considerate man," Garrett said, pressing a kiss to Grace's temple that made her toes curl in her expensive shoes. "When it comes to the people I love." The words were clearly for Victoria's benefit, but they hit Grace like a physical blow. She found herself leaning into his warmth, breathing in his cologne, and wondering when exactly she'd started wanting this to be real. "We should go," Garrett murmured against her hair. "I promised Grace a private tour of the gardens." As they walked away, Grace could feel Victoria's gaze burning into her back. But all she could focus on was the way Garrett's hand felt against her lower back, warm and steady and reassuringly real. "That," Garrett said once they were out of earshot, "was absolutely magnificent. Did you see Victoria's face when you mentioned fraud investigations?" Grace laughed, the sound slightly shaky with leftover adrenaline. "I thought she was going to choke on her champagne, though I have a feeling I just made a very expensive enemy." "Victoria Sterling has been my enemy since I refused to marry her 3 years ago," Garrett said dismissively. "You just gave her a taste of her own medicine." They paused beside a fountain where marble cherubs frolicked in crystal-clear water, the sound of splashing water providing a peaceful counterpoint to the distant murmur of the luncheon. "Garrett," Grace said quietly, "when you said those things back there, about finding someone worth staying for." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dappled sunlight filtering through the ancient oak trees. "Grace, I know it was just for show," she said quickly, before she could lose her nerve. "But for a moment there, it almost felt real," he finished, his voice rough with something she couldn't identify. "Yeah," she whispered. "Real." For a heartbeat, they stood frozen in the garden, surrounded by the scent of roses and the weight of words that couldn't be taken back. Then Garrett's phone buzzed with an incoming call, shattering the moment like glass. "We should head back," he said, his mask of control sliding back into place. "But Grace?" You were perfect today. Absolutely perfect." As they walked back toward the terrace, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. The line between pretense and reality was becoming dangerously blurred, and she wasn't sure either of them knew how to find their way back. "Mija, if this pendejo breaks your heart, I'm going to break his kneecaps. And I know exactly where to hide the body because I watch a lot of CSI. Grace nearly choked on her café con leche as her mother's threat reached Garrett's ears across the tiny kitchen of her childhood home in Queens. Garrett, to his credit, didn't even flinch, just continued helping her father assemble what appeared to be a bookshelf that had more pieces than a NASA shuttle. "Mama," Grace protested, her cheeks flaming red. "You can't threaten to murder my fiancé on the first meeting." "Watch me," Carmen Parker replied, stirring her sofrito with the intensity of someone planning an actual murder. "Besides, any man who wants to marry my daughter should be able to handle a little maternal interrogation. Isn't that right, Garrett?" Garrett looked up from the instruction manual he'd been studying with the focus of a war strategist. "Mrs. Parker, I'd be disappointed if you didn't threaten bodily harm. It shows how much you love Grace." Carmen paused mid-stir, clearly not expecting such a reasonable response. "Well, good. As long as we understand each other." Grace watched in fascination as her mother, who had been prepared to grill Garrett like a suspect in a crime drama, was slowly being won over by his complete lack of pretension. He'd shown up at their modest two-bedroom apartment in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, carrying flowers for her mother, and offering to help her father with whatever project needed doing. "You know," her father Miguel said, as he squinted at a diagram that made no sense whatsoever, "when Grace said she was engaged to a billionaire, I pictured someone more, how do you say, stuck up." "Papa," Grace warned, but Garrett just laughed. "Most billionaires are stuck up," he admitted, holding a wooden panel steady while Miguel attempted to attach it to something that definitely wasn't the right piece. "I was raised to be stuck up. Took me years to realize it was making me miserable." "What changed?" Carmen asked, her maternal radar clearly pinging something interesting. Garrett's hand stilled on the bookshelf, and Grace saw something flicker across his face. Pain, quickly hidden behind his usual composure. "I realized that all the money in the world can't buy you the things that actually matter. Family, genuine affection, people who love you for who you are, not what you can do for them." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle bubbling of Carmen's sofrito. Grace felt her heart do something complicated and dangerous in her chest. "That's a hard lesson to learn," Miguel said quietly. "But an important one." "The hardest," Garrett agreed. "Grace is helping me remember what those things feel like." Grace stared at him, searching his face for signs that this was just another performance. But his expression was open, vulnerable in a way that made her chest tight with something she didn't want to name. "Okay, that's enough feelings for one morning," Carmen announced, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "Grace, show this man where we keep the good coffee. If he's going to be part of this family, he needs to understand that we don't drink that watery nonsense rich people call espresso." As Grace led Garrett to the small pantry, her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Maria. "Girl, your man is fine and he actually seems to like your crazy family. If this is fake, I'm nominating you both for Oscars." Grace glanced at Garrett, who was examining her mother's coffee collection with the same attention he probably gave million-dollar contracts. The problem was Maria was right. Nothing about Garrett's behavior felt fake. He genuinely seemed to enjoy her father's terrible jokes and her mother's protective interrogation. "Your family is wonderful," Garrett said quietly, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the scent of her mother's cooking. "I can see where you get your strength from." "They're pretty great," Grace agreed, then hesitated. "Garrett, what you said about learning what family feels like. What did you mean?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father died when I was 12. Car accident. My mother. She never recovered. She threw herself into society, into appearances, into making sure the Blackstone name maintained its reputation. Love became a luxury we couldn't afford." Grace felt her heart crack a little. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It made me who I am. Successful, independent, self-sufficient. His smile was rueful. It also made me someone who doesn't know how to let people in. Someone who treats relationships like business transactions. Is that what this is? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A business transaction? Garrett turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense in the dim light of the pantry. It started that way. And now? Before he could answer, the pantry door burst open and Carmen appeared like an avenging angel armed with a wooden spoon. What are you two doing in here? If you want to make out, go to Grace's room like decent people. The coffee is for drinking, not for hiding behind while you feel each other up. Mama! Grace shrieked, mortified. What? You think I don't know what engaged people do? How do you think you got here, Mia? The stork? Garrett's laughter was rich and genuine. Mrs. Parker, I promise we were just talking about coffee. Carmen said skeptically. Well, talk faster. Your friend Maria is here, and she brought her cousin Rico, who apparently has opinions about your engagement. They emerged from the pantry to find Maria Martinez holding court in the living room, along with a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a romance novel. If romance novels were written about brooding mechanics with trust issues. Grace! Maria jumped up, her dark eyes sparkling with mischief. You didn't tell me your fiancé was even hotter in person. If I wasn't happily married, I'd fight you for him. Hands off, Grace said automatically, then caught herself. Why was she being possessive over a fake relationship? Rico, Garrett said, extending his hand to the scowling man. Nice to meet you. Rico ignored the outstretched hand, his arms crossed over his impressive chest. So you're the billionaire who thinks he can buy my cousin. Rico, Grace warned, but Garrett held up a hand. He's right to be suspicious, Garrett said calmly. If someone showed up claiming to love my sister after knowing her for 3 days, I'd want to punch them too. I don't have a sister, Rico replied. But Grace is the closest thing I've got to one, and I've seen what happens when rich guys play games with good women. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Grace could see her parents exchanging worried glances while Maria looked like she was watching the world's most entertaining soap opera. Rico, Grace said firmly, Garrett isn't playing games. Isn't he? Rico's dark eyes fixed on Garrett with laser intensity. Because funny thing, I called my buddy who works security at the Blackstone building, says he's never seen you with the same woman twice, says you've got a reputation for loving and leaving. Grace felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She looked at Garrett, whose face had gone carefully blank. That's all in the past, Garrett said quietly. Is it? Rico pressed. Because it seems convenient that right when you need to clean up your image for some big business deal, you suddenly find love with a nice girl from Queens. Stop, Grace said, but Rico was on a roll. How much is he paying you, Grace? Because whatever it is, it's not worth destroying yourself for some rich boy's games. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace could feel everyone's eyes on her, waiting for her to deny it, to defend their love, to prove that Rico was wrong. But she couldn't. Because Rico wasn't wrong, was he? This was a business arrangement. She was being paid, in cleared debts and a lifestyle she could never afford on her own. And Garrett. God, what if everything he'd said, every moment of apparent sincerity, was just another performance? Grace? Garrett said, his voice rough with something that sounded like desperation. Let me explain. Explain what? She asked, her voice hollow. That Rico is right? That this is all just a convenient arrangement for you? It's not that simple. Isn't it? Grace felt tears burning her eyes and hated herself for it. Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty simple. You needed a respectable fiancé and I needed money. Everything else? That was just good acting, wasn't it? Garrett's face went white. Grace, you have to believe me. I have to go, Grace said, pushing past him toward the door. I need air. I need to think. Grace, wait. But she was already gone, leaving behind a room full of shocked silence and a man who looked like he'd just lost everything that mattered. Maria found her on the fire escape 20 minutes later, mascara streaked and shivering in the October wind. "Want to talk about it?" Maria asked, settling beside her on the metal grating. "Was I an idiot?" Grace asked. "For thinking that maybe, possibly some of it was real?" Maria was quiet for a long moment. "Honey, I've known you since we were 15. I've never seen you look at a man the way you look at him. And more importantly, I've never seen a man look at you the way he looks at you. But Rico's right. This whole thing is fake." "Maybe it started fake," Maria said carefully. "But that man down there is pacing your mother's kitchen like a caged animal, and your father had to physically restrain him from following you up here. That doesn't look fake to me." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What if I'm falling for someone who's just really good at pretending?" "Then you're going to get your heart broken," Maria said honestly. "But what if you're not? What if he's falling just as hard as you are and you're both too scared to admit it?" Through the window, Grace could see Garrett sitting at her mother's kitchen table, his head in his hands while Carmen set a cup of coffee in front of him with uncharacteristic gentleness. "There's only one way to find out," Maria continued. "You're going to have to trust him, or walk away now before it gets any worse." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. 6 months had seemed like such a simple arrangement when she was hungover and desperate. Now it felt like the most complicated thing she'd ever attempted. "What would you do?" she asked. Maria smiled.
"I'd ask myself one question. Is what I felt with him worth the risk of getting my heart broken?" Grace looked through the window again, watching Garrett's shoulders shake as her mother said something that made him laugh, despite his obvious distress. Her heart gave a painful squeeze. "Yeah," she whispered. "It is. Well, isn't this precious? The gold digger actually thought it was real, and now she's crying about it like some tragic heroine in a soap opera."
Grace froze in the doorway of Garrett's home office, Victoria Sterling's venomous words hitting her like ice water. Through the gap in the partially open door, she could see Victoria perched on the edge of Garrett's desk, like a predatory cat, while Garrett stood with his back to both women staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. "Victoria, that's enough," Garrett said quietly, but there was no real heat in his voice. "Is it?" Victoria laughed, the sound sharp as breaking crystal. "Darling, I'm trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life. This little arrangement has gone on long enough, don't you think? The Sterling Industries merger is practically guaranteed now. Your reputation has been sufficiently rehabilitated. Time to cut the dead weight." Grace's blood turned to liquid nitrogen in her veins. The merger. Of course. She'd been so caught up in the fantasy of it all that she'd forgotten this was never about her. It was about business. It was always about business. "The girl served her purpose," Victoria continued, examining her perfect manicure with theatrical boredom. "But honestly, Garrett, you can't seriously be considering continuing this charade. She's a nobody from Queens who doesn't even know which fork to use for the fish course." "She knew exactly which fork to use," Garrett said, his voice still unnaturally calm. "She also knew that the Pemberton charity was embezzling funds, spotted 3 tax fraud schemes at the Vanderbilt luncheon, and called out Senator Morrison's wife for insider trading, all while looking absolutely stunning and making everyone in the room either want to be her or be with her." Grace's heart did a painful little flutter at his words, but Victoria just waved her hand dismissively. "Details, darling. The point is, she doesn't belong in our world, and deep down you know it. Just like you knew it when you designed this whole elaborate scheme to win the Sterling merger." Victoria's smile was poisonous honey. "Oh yes, I know all about your little arrangement. The contract, the timeline, the very convenient way this engagement materialized right when you needed to clean up your image for our family's business deal." Garrett's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. "How? Please. You think James hasn't been my source inside Blackstone Industries for years? That sweet little assistant of yours has been feeding me information in exchange for his son's medical bills. Amazing what people will do for money, isn't it?" Grace felt sick, not just because of the betrayal but because of how easily she'd been played, how naive she'd been to think that any part of this could be real. "The question is," Victoria continued, sliding off the desk and moving to stand beside Garrett, Are you ready to end this ridiculous farce and marry someone actually suitable? Someone who can help you build an empire instead of whatever it is that girl does with her little calculator. Grace waited for Garrett to defend her, to tell Victoria she was wrong, to show some sign that the man who'd held her hand in her mother's kitchen still existed. Instead, he was silent. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, long enough for Grace's heart to crack clean in half. "You're right," Garrett finally said, his voice hollow. "This has gone on long enough." Grace bit her fist to keep from making a sound, tasting blood as her teeth broke skin. "I knew you'd see reason," Victoria purred, moving closer to him. "We can announce our engagement at the charity gala next week. The merger will be finalized and everything will be exactly as it should be." "Yes," Garrett said quietly. "Everything as it should be." Grace couldn't listen to another second. She turned and fled down the marble hallway, her designer heels clicking against the floor like a countdown to heartbreak. Behind her, she could hear Victoria's triumphant laughter echoing through the mansion like the sound of her own stupidity. She made it to the bedroom she'd foolishly started thinking of as theirs, before the tears came. Great, ugly sobs that shook her whole body as she threw clothes into the suitcase she'd barely unpacked. How had she been so stupid? How had she let herself believe that a man like Garrett Blackstone could actually fall for a woman like her? "Grace?" She spun around to find Garrett standing in the doorway, his face pale and his hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. "Don't," she said, her voice thick with tears. "Just don't." "You heard." "I heard enough." She yanked another dress from the closet, not caring that it was probably worth more than her car. "The Sterling merger, the arrangement, the fact that James has been spying on you for Victoria. Oh, and my personal favorite, the part where you agreed that this has gone on long enough." Garrett flinched as if she'd slapped him. "Grace, let me explain." "Explain what?" She whirled to face him, fury and heartbreak warring in her chest. "That you're exactly what everyone said you were? A cold, calculating businessman who treats people like chess pieces? That's not, isn't it?" Grace laughed bitterly. "God, I'm such an idiot. You know what the worst part is? I actually started to believe it was real. I thought maybe you were falling for me the way I was falling for you." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Garrett's face went white. "Grace, save it," she said, zipping up her suitcase with violent precision. "I'm sure Victoria will make you very happy. You two deserve each other. A perfect pair of beautiful, soulless people playing games with other people's hearts." She moved toward the door, but Garrett stepped into her path. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Grace looked up at him, memorizing his face one last time. The sharp angles of his cheekbones, the gray eyes that had looked at her like she was something precious, the mouth that had kissed her temple and made her believe in fairy tales. "This was always temporary. I just forgot that for a while. It doesn't have to be." The words were barely audible, rough with something that sounded like desperation. "Yes, it does." Grace's voice was steady now, resigned. "Because you'll never choose me over your empire, Garrett, and I'll never be content to be someone's convenient arrangement." She stepped around him, heading for the door. "Tell Mrs. Henderson I said goodbye. She was the best part of this whole mess." "Grace, wait." But she was already gone, walking away from the most beautiful mistake of her life. Garrett stood alone in the bedroom that suddenly felt cavernous without her presence, staring at the space where she'd been. On the nightstand, catching the afternoon light, sat the engagement ring she'd left behind, a circle of diamonds and promises that had never been real. Except they had been real. At least, they had been for him. He sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands as the full weight of what he'd lost crashed over him. He'd spent so long protecting himself, building walls, treating relationships like business transactions, that when something genuine had walked into his life, he'd been too scared to recognize it. No, that wasn't true. He had recognized it. He'd felt it every time Grace smiled at him, every time she challenged him, every time she looked at him like he was more than just his bank account. He'd known exactly what he was falling for. He'd just been too much of a coward to fight for it when it mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Dinner tonight to celebrate? I'll have my assistant call yours to coordinate." Garrett stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. He walked to his desk, pulled out the contract that had started this whole mess, and fed it into the shredder. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. "James, I need you to prepare my resignation from the Sterling merger and cancel all my appointments for the next week." "Sir, the merger is worth hundreds of millions." "I don't care," Garrett said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I need to fix the biggest mistake of my life." "And what would that be, sir?" Garrett looked at the empty bedroom, at the indentation in the pillow where Grace's head had rested, at the life he'd built that meant nothing without her in it. "I let the best thing that ever happened to me walk away," he said quietly. "And I'm going to spend however long it takes to convince her to come back." "Sir," James said carefully, "are you sure that's wise? The merger?" "James," Garrett interrupted, "how much are they paying you?" Silence on the other end of the line. "Whatever Victoria Sterling is paying you to spy on me," Garrett continued, "I'll triple it. But more importantly, I'll make sure your son gets the medical care he needs. No strings attached. Because that's what people who care about each other do. They help. They don't use each other's desperation as leverage." Another long silence. Then, "She said you'd never find out." "I don't care about Victoria," Garrett said. "I care about Grace. And if there's even a chance she'll forgive me, I'm going to take it." Because for the first time in his life, Garrett Blackstone had found something worth more than money, more than power, more than the empire he'd spent years building. He'd found love. And he'd be damned if he was going to let it slip away without a fight. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to tell you about the most spectacular fraud I've ever encountered. And this time the criminal is me. Grace's head snapped up from her cafe table so fast she nearly gave herself whiplash. There, standing on the small stage of Maria's cousin's coffee shop in Queens, was Garrett Blackstone. In jeans and a wrinkled button-down, holding a microphone like he was about to perform at an open mic night instead of addressing the packed room of her family, friends, and half the neighborhood who'd shown up for what they thought was just another Wednesday evening poetry reading. "Grace," Maria whispered urgently from the seat beside her, "your billionaire just crashed my cousin's coffee shop." "Ex-billionaire," Grace corrected automatically, though her traitorous heart was doing somersaults in her chest. "And what is he doing here?" "Being either incredibly romantic or completely insane," her mother answered from the other side, looking torn between approval and the urge to throw her churro at him. Garrett's eyes found hers across the crowded room, and Grace felt her breath catch. He looked terrible, exhausted, desperate, and more real than she'd ever seen him. His perfect hair was disheveled, there were dark circles under his eyes, and his usually immaculate appearance was replaced by something raw and honest. "For those of you who don't know me," Garrett continued, his voice carrying clearly through the small space, "I'm Garrett Blackstone. I'm the man who convinced Grace Parker to pretend to be my fiancée for 6 months so I could win a business deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars." A collective gasp went through the room. Rico, sitting near the front, looked like he was preparing to commit murder. "I know what you're thinking," Garrett said, raising his hand to forestall the angry murmurs starting to ripple through the crowd. "What kind of person uses someone like that? What kind of man treats love like a business transaction? And you'd be right to think those things because that's exactly who I was." Grace felt tears burning her eyes, but she couldn't look away. "I was a man who thought that everything, including people, had a price, that relationships were just another form of negotiation, that love was a luxury I couldn't afford because it made you weak, vulnerable, stupid." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "And then I met Grace." "Oh, this is good," Mrs. Martinez whispered to Grace's mother. "This is telenovela level good." "Grace," Garrett continued, his gaze locked on hers, "didn't just challenge my world, she turned it completely upside down. She walked into a room full of Manhattan's elite and made them all look small and petty just by being herself. She saw through every lie, every pretense, every wall I'd built, and somehow still found something worth caring about underneath. Grace's hand went to her chest, where her heart was hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. I told myself it was all part of the act. Every time she made me laugh, every time she called me on my nonsense, every time she looked at me like I was worth more than my bank account, I convinced myself it was just her playing her part beautifully. His smile was rueful and heartbreaking. But the truth is, I fell in love with Grace Parker about 30 seconds after she woke up in my bedroom calling me insane. "And what did you do about it?" Rico called out, his voice carrying a clear threat. Garrett's smile turned self-deprecating. "I panicked. I let fear and old habits take over. When someone threatened to expose what we had, I chose the safe option. I chose business over love, money over the woman who'd become my entire world." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I let her walk away. The coffee shop was silent except for the hiss of the espresso machine and the sound of Grace's mother sniffling into her napkin. "But here's the thing about love," Garrett said, his voice growing stronger. "Real love doesn't follow a business plan. It doesn't care about timelines or profit margins or what makes sense on paper. Real love makes you want to be better than you ever thought you could be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, not the massive, ostentatious ring from before, but something smaller, simpler. "Grace," he said, stepping down from the stage and walking toward her table through the crowd that parted like the Red Sea. "I can't offer you billions of dollars anymore. I walked away from the Sterling merger, which probably makes me the dumbest businessman in Manhattan. I can't promise you a life of luxury or social status or any of the things I thought mattered." He dropped to one knee beside her table, and Grace's mother made a sound that was half sob, half cheer. "But I can offer you something I've never offered another living soul," Garrett continued, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant solitaire that caught the warm light of the coffee shop and sparkled like captured starlight. "I can offer you my heart. All of it. The broken parts, the scared parts, the parts that don't know how to love properly, but are desperate to learn." Grace stared at him, at the ring, at the man who'd just thrown away an empire for her. "The first proposal was fake," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. "A business arrangement between two people who were pretending to be something they weren't. This proposal is real. From a man who loves you more than his next breath, to a woman who taught him that some things are worth more than money." "Garrett," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. "Marry me, Grace. Not because of a contract or an arrangement or because it makes sense. Marry me because you love me back, even though I'm an idiot who almost let you get away. Marry me because you want to build something real with someone who will spend the rest of his life trying to deserve you." The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Grace looked around the room at all the faces staring at her expectantly. Her parents, Maria, Rico, neighbors she'd known since childhood, all waiting to see what she would do. Then she looked back at Garrett, kneeling beside her table in a Queens coffee shop, looking nothing like the polished billionaire she'd first met, and everything like the man she'd fallen hopelessly in love with. "You're right," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "You are an idiot." Garrett's face fell, and Grace heard her mother make a small sound of distress. "But," Grace continued, standing up and cupping his face in her hands, "you're my idiot. And yes, Garrett Blackstone, I will marry you, not because you're rich, which you're apparently not anymore, and not because it makes sense, which it absolutely doesn't, but because I love you, the real you. The man who helps my father build furniture and lets my mother threaten him with kitchen utensils and who just gave up everything he thought he wanted for something he didn't even know he needed." The coffee shop erupted in cheers as Garrett surged to his feet and kissed her, pouring months of suppressed emotion into the contact. Grace melted into him, tasting tears, hers or his, she couldn't tell, and feeling like she was finally home. "I love you," Garrett whispered against her lips. "I love your stubborn streak and your terrible coffee shop habits and the way you make me want to be a better man." "I love you too," Grace whispered back. "Even if you did just crash my neighborhood coffee shop to propose to me in front of half of Queens." "About that," Garrett said, grinning as he slipped the ring onto her finger. I may have bought the building and offered to pay for everyone's coffee for the next year. I wanted to make sure I had a receptive audience. Grace stared at him. You bought the building? Well, I needed somewhere to open my new business, Garrett said, looking suddenly uncertain. I was thinking about starting a financial consulting firm. Help small businesses with their books, maybe do some pro bono work for nonprofits. Nothing fancy, just something that actually matters. And you want to base it here? In Queens? I want to base it wherever you are, Garrett said simply. Home isn't a mansion on the Upper East Side, Grace. Home is wherever you're making terrible coffee and arguing with tax forms and being the most amazing woman I've ever met. This is better than my novellas, Mrs. Martinez announced loudly, wiping tears from her eyes. Much better, Grace's mother agreed, beaming at them both. And now I have a son-in-law who can actually afford to spoil my grandchildren. About those grandchildren, Garrett started, grinning wickedly. Oh no, Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. One life-changing moment at a time, please. I just said yes to marrying a former billionaire in a coffee shop in Queens. Let me process that before we start planning the next generation. Deal, Garrett said, spinning her around as the crowd cheered again. But just so you know, Mrs. Blackstone, I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes. Mrs. Blackstone, Grace repeated, testing the words. I like the sound of that. Good, Garrett murmured, pulling her close again. Because you're stuck with me now. For better or worse, richer or poorer. And given that I just tanked my net worth for love, probably poorer. I don't care about the money, Grace said firmly. I never did. I know, Garrett said, his voice soft with wonder. That's what makes you perfect. As they kissed again, surrounded by cheering friends and family in a coffee shop that smelled like dreams and new beginnings, Grace couldn't help but think that fairy tales didn't always end in castles. Sometimes they ended in the most unexpected places, with the most imperfect people, building something real and beautiful and absolutely worth fighting for. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they ended with a man who loved you enough to give up everything for the chance to build a life that actually mattered. So, Grace said, pulling back to look at her new fiancé, her real fiancé, with sparkling eyes. What do we do now? Garrett's smile was brighter than all the diamonds he'd ever owned. Now, we start our real love story. And they did.